Hey guys, it's your friend the Little Historian here. Sorry I haven't been in contact for the past few weeks, but I've had, other stuff on that I got to do. Today I wanted to talk about an English queen that's not as famous as most of them, and probably not as well known. She is Isabella, the she-wolf of France. Her father was King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair. He's the guy who basically abolished the Knights Templar and then murdered a lot of them, just so he could get his hands on their treasure. But luckily he never got to their treasure. Isabella was born around 1295. We don't know much about her childhood, unfortunately. But at a very young age, we do know she was destined to marry Prince Edward, the future Edward II of England. He was the son of Edward I, Edward Longshanks, as he's known. You know, the guy who put down the William Wallace Rebellion. Now, in this video, I'm going to try to do my best to separate fact from fiction. As many of you probably grew up watching the film Braveheart, and Isabella was one of Wallace's love interests in that film. I'm sorry to disappoint a lot of you, but that is fiction. That didn't happen. In reality, Isabella was far too young at the time of Wallace's rebellion in Scotland to have an affair with him and to bear a child with him. In reality, she was married to Edward, Prince Edward, when he gained the throne in 1307, I think, after Longshanks passed away. I think they got married in France and then traveled back to England. Now, one of the rumors about Prince Edward is that he was one of England's earliest homosexual kings, gay kings. And he's known for that because, not only because of the way he's portrayed in the film Braveheart, but in reality Prince Edward was known to have a lot of male favorites at his court. So that kind of helps that particular rumor. Of course, no one can prove anything, but that's just what we think. Actually, there are quite a few kings in English history that might have been homosexual that we think about when we study the history. And at least one English queen that might have been homosexual. Of course, we can't prove it, really. There's just the rumors. Now, during their wedding banquet, now granted, Isabella was still very young at the time. She wasn't quite childbearing age yet. She was only 11 or 12, I think, when she arrived in England. And married Prince Edward. Edward gained the throne in 1307, around the same time, I think. So he became King Edward II, because his father was, Edward I. But already at that point, from a young age, Edward was known to surround himself with his male favorites. And his biggest male favorite at the time was a young nobleman of Gascon French origin, I think. I'm not an expert on the Gascon part, but I think he was of French aristocracy of some kind. That gentleman's name was a young man named Piers Gaveston, and Edward was very attached to this man. He gave him titles, he gave him presents, gifts of all kinds. There's even a legend that at the wedding ceremony, Edward not only ditched his new bride, Isabella, and sat with his friend Gaveston during the banquet, but there's a myth that Edward gave his favorite all the gifts that Isabella's father, his new father-in-law, King Philip, gave to the new couple. Edward just right up, the story is, Edward gave all of the gifts over to his favorite Gaveston, and of course no one liked that. A lot of the barons at the English court did not like Gaveston because he was kind of, I guess we'd call him today, he's usually portrayed as the kind of snobby, aristocratic, bratty, almost rich boy who gets everything because he's a great friend of the king, and the king only pays attention to him. Now, I don't know if I used the best words to describe that situation, but forgive me, they were the only words that I could think of on how to describe him in that type of way. Of course, we don't know if any of that's true. That's just part of the stories as well. Now, during their marriage, there is a theory that Isabella eventually got into a share her husband deal with Gaveston. So they would be living a kind of threesome lifestyle at the palace. And Gaveston and Isabella eventually learned how to work together in sharing the king in some way. But eventually the nobles that were known as the barons of the court, they had enough with Gaveston. They were tired of the King Edward, giving him so many titles, when he basically didn't come from, Gaveston did not come from as high a ranking noble family as, I guess, most of the English court at the time came from. So Gaveston was kind of, I guess, what we'd call a minor noble compared to all the other nobles at the court, all the other nobles that are usually at the court. So the nobles were not only jealous, but due to the circumstances of the time, the nobles / barons, the high-ranking ones, thought that this was a complete insult, that a minor aristocrat like Gaveston was getting more important titles than themselves and getting more favors from the king than they were. So they basically, plus Gaveston at times would go around insulting them. He gave them very insulting nicknames. I don't know how insulting they are today, but some of them probably are still quite insulting. I mean, he called one the Black Dog. He called another, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but Gaveston called another the Jew. He came up with all these insulting nicknames for these barons that obviously were insulting at the time and to some people might still be insulting today when you think about it. So, of course, the barons did not like Gaveston, and they wanted him out of the way. They first tried to force Edward to stop being the number one guy in charge of the kingdom, so to speak. They thought, because Edward wasn't a very good king to begin with, he didn't really take the job of king as in looking after his people, going off and conquering new lands, things like that, very well. He tried to finish the work his father started, finish conquering Scotland. And if you read the history books, of course, that went disastrously wrong. He was majorly defeated in 1314 at the Battle of Bannockburn in Scotland, where Scotland finally won its independence for the first time. And I've actually been to Bannockburn in Scotland. Unfortunately, I didn't get very much time there because I was part of a traveling bus tour. So unfortunately, we didn't get to spend that much time there. But so I wish I got to spend more time there because it's a pretty neat place to visit. But yeah, Edward he definitely was not his father. He really did not have much military experience, which kind of explains that. I think his father, Longshanks, did take young Prince Edward out with him on some of his campaigns, or at least he tried to, but his son never really got into that kind of manly man stuff of the day that his father was hoping he'd get into. Edward, from what we know, Prince Edward was more interested in activities of the common people. He liked, I think swimming was one of them. He liked building stuff. He liked thatching roofs. He liked things that ordinary common people had to do for the most part in those days, compared to the privileges that the aristocrats got to do. I mean, he did like some activities that aristocrats and the nobility did, but for the most part, at least what I know is he liked more things and chores that the everyday common peasantry either liked or had to do in their everyday lives. So, and today we wouldn't have a problem with people like that. Today that's perfectly fine for anybody to like that. But at the time, obviously, rules and society were thought of differently and were expected to be done differently. So that's just what the class system was at the time. So basically the barons came to Parliament one day and confronted Edward and Gaveston and told him that A, he needed to banish Gaveston from court, never let him come back, and B, he needed to take the job of being king more seriously, so to speak, and give the ordinary barons and nobles their usual titles back. At first, of course, Edward did not want to banish his friend, so to speak, and he probably tried everything he could to not have to do that, but in the end, he was forced to banish Gaveston. Gaveston was sent back to France, I think, if my knowledge is right. But of course, being Edward, he did not keep Gaveston back there long. Now here's the thing. The barons also reminded Edward that if Gaveston ever came back, they would execute him. And what does Edward do? Tries to come up with a plan that if Gaveston returns, he wouldn't be executed. But not being the sharpest tool in the shed, so to speak, you could say, Edward II allowed Gaveston to come back, and I guess didn't really think that long on how to figure out a plan where his buddy would eventually be executed. Because he just wanted him back. One of the reasons why Edward liked having these male favorites was not just because he might have wanted them for lovers, but because he hated doing the paperwork of being king. He wasn't good at being king at anything to do with it. And he was kind of probably lazy at trying to be a king too. He didn't really get into that or want to get into the important things you have to do in order to be a king, in order to rule a kingdom. Edward had no interest in doing any of that. He was just in it for, the party time, basically. He didn't want to do any of the hard work. I mean, who would? We all wish we didn't have to do hard work in our life, but the truth is we have to do it whether we like it or not. But Edward thought he didn't have to do any of that. So one of the reasons why he had these male favorites was because supposedly they were much better at doing the paperwork and running the kingdom, even if some of them were running the kingdom the wrong way. They were much better at doing that work than the king himself was. So Edward left all the paperwork stuff at being king and ruling a government to his favorites so he wouldn't have to do it. So anyway, Gaveston does come back after a short period of time. He either was sent off to be the royal governor of Ireland, or he was sent back to France. I can't remember which. But eventually Gaveston does come back. And one of the reasons he comes back is because his wife might have been having her child at the time, which is obviously a reason why the husband/father would want to come back, is because his wife is about to have a child. But I'm not exactly sure when that happened, if that event happened around the same time. Also, a couple years into their marriage, Isabella finally gave birth an heir to King Edward. She gave birth to her first son, who becomes the famous medieval King Edward III. He's the future Edward III, her first son. So that's good news. But back to the other situation. Gaveston comes back. Of course, all the nobles find out. And they force Edward, Gaveston, and of course Edward is dragging his wife along for the ride, poor Isabella, all throughout the country trying to stay one step ahead of the pursuing barons and nobles who want to get rid of Gaveston. They eventually end up at one of their castles, and Edward and Isabella escape For some reason, Gaveston stays. I don't remember the deeper versions of the story, but for some reason, Gaveston stays. I think maybe because it's actually one of Gaveston's castles that Edward might have given him, not actually Edward's castle. It's one of Gaveston's properties. So Gaveston is left at his castle, and one of the barons, his army surrounds the castle, forces Gaveston to surrender, and of course Gaveston is forced to surrender and is taken prisoner. The barons put Gaveston on trial, and of course it's not a fair trial, and the poor guy is taken outside and beheaded, basically. Actually, I think the executioner stabs Gaveston, then beheads him. So I think that's how his execution went. Eventually, Gaveston is buried in I think a grave in one of the nearby chapels. But at first, his body is, of course, just thrown into a unmarked grave with no respect whatsoever. But eventually he's moved to a more respectful, suitable grave. Edward, when he hears the news, is of course devastated. And he goes back hard on the rebelling barons. He executes a few of them, of course, and he imprisons their families. Both the women and the children are imprisoned. I don't exactly know what happens to them if they're eventually, years later, when Edward is dead and overthrown, if they're released from prison or if they're just left there to die. I'm not exactly sure. But for a while, for a time, Edward and his family do pretty good for the short period between favorites. The relationship between Edward and Isabella do pretty good. Of course, she has several more children, so that's nice. She has an heir and a spare and a couple others, which is nice. And Edward's, of course, happy about that. But then, a couple years after Bannockburn and after Gaveston's execution, another favorite arrives. His name is Hugh Despenser. Now, Hugh Despenser was much more a villain in the story than Gaveston was. Why? Because Hugh Despenser was more greedy. He came from probably a more powerful family. He was cruel. He liked to imprison people, take their properties, things like that. He and his father, who was ironically also called Hugh Despenser, were very loyal to the previous king, Edward I, Prince Edward's father. So when Edward II came to the throne, they continued their loyalty with the royal family. They tried to imprison, the Despensers tried to imprison, because he was one of the barons who rose up against King Edward the first time. The Despensers tried to imprison and confiscate the land of a nobleman and knight. I think he was a knight. A knight called Roger Mortimer. But luckily, Roger Mortimer escaped from the Tower of London. Probably one of the few prisoners to ever be able to do that. Um, at least to my knowledge, he's one of the few prisoners who was ever able to escape from the Tower of London. But Mortimer escapes and flees over to France, across the channel. And he will come into the story a short time later on. He'll play a bigger role in the story. But anyway, so the next thing the dispensers do, apart from what they're already doing, is pretty bad enough, but they then arrest or banish all the French-speaking people in Isabella's circle, her own personal circle. They arrest or banish all of them, and they of course take more, probably confiscate more of Isabella's belongings. And what's worse is they steal, the dispensers steal away Isabella's own children from her to raise them themselves. And Edward, having this new favorite who's helping him run the country, even though he's not really doing a good job doing it, does nothing to get Isabella her children back. He does nothing to help. So that's really one of the major breaking points in the story between Isabella and her husband. So of course Isabella is furious that her children were taken. But what are you going to do? Your husband won't listen to her. And keep in mind, back then, women had even noble women and royal women had very, very few rights compared to today. Compared to today, they had very few rights. Even though Isabella was quite a smart woman, and she definitely was clever and knew how to work in politics. In this case, she had very few rights, which is totally unfair to our modern standpoint. That's totally unfair, obviously. But at the moment, she couldn't really do anything. Then she's sent back to her home country, France, to negotiate some kind of deal with her brother, who's now the new French king. I can't remember if her brother was another Philip or another Louis. I can't remember which one, but it's one of her brothers who's now the new king of France. So Isabella is sent back to her native land, her home country, to try to work out a peace deal between England and France so they don't go to war. And while there, Isabella gets the idea that she will not return to England until her husband banishes his new favorite, the dispensers, which is a pretty clever move when you think about it. I will not return to my husband until he promises to banish and to never have any other new favorites that can be more important than the Queen herself, basically. She also basically describes that speech, and I think she dresses the part as well. She basically, when she makes that speech, she wears widow's black, as if she's a widow, because that's what she feels like at this moment. She feels like a widow because her husband is completely ignoring her, is acting like she doesn't exist. So it's almost like she has no husband. So when you think about it that way, of course, I don't know if she actually wore the widow's black when she made this speech, but it kind of, I guess it kind of helps with, that idea kind of helps with the story, so to speak. And of course, while in France, Isabella starts her relationship with Roger Mortimer. You know, the guy who was able to escape from the Tower of London earlier and flee to France. Isabella starts a relationship with Mortimer. At first, Edward tries to send his eldest son, future Edward III, to finish the business deal with his uncle, the new king of France, Isabella's brother, and maybe to persuade his mother to come back to England. But once young Edward is in France, Isabella has a trump card, a new trump card, and refuses to let her son return to England. So she was definitely she was a lot smarter than her husband and his favorites thought she would be. Yeah, she was far superior than she looked. So while in France, Isabella and her lover Mortimer begin to plan an invasion back to England to force Edward to, I forget what the word is, abdicate. Sorry, my bad. Force Edward to abdicate and to get rid of his new favorite, dispenser. And meanwhile, back in England, a lot of people were beginning to see how poor a king Edward was, and how he's just giving everything to his favorites and not caring about the people themselves, really, which is kind of the way he acted from the very beginning. So, kind of. So he never really stopped acting like that, acting like a pompous jerk, or if I'm allowed to say it, pompous jackass. But anyway, so people are beginning to either, if you're poor, you have to stay in the country, but you can secretly be against the king who's doing a poor job at doing it. If you're one of the nobles, you could find a way to flee to France and join Queen Isabella's cause and Mortimer's cause. So anyway, news of the invasion is getting bigger and bigger. Edward and Spencer are trying their best to come up with their own defense army. But of course, no one wants to help them. No one wants to join the army to help a king who's just giving everything to his new favorite. Everyone wants to join Team Isabella and Team Mortimer and not stay with Team Edward and Team Dispenser. I think there's a story that Edward and Dispenser, during the height of the invasion, They try to assemble an army of a few thousand to defend them, and only about 50 soldiers show up. That's it, 50. So it's a pretty poor situation these two guys are in. Anyway, Isabella gets more help for her new army invasion force by having her son, Prince Edward, the future Edward III, to marry. Well, he actually does. He falls in love and eventually marries a young noblewoman named Philippa from the region, an area called Hainault. I'm not exactly sure where Hainault is in comparison to present day Europe. I'm sorry about that. I'm not exactly sure where the kingdom of Hainault would be situated, but I'm guessing maybe around the France, Belgium area, but that's just my guess. I'm not exactly sure. But Edward falls in love with Philippa of Hainault, and they are engaged and destined to be married. Young Prince Edward, I mean. That's his future queen. So by making that marriage deal, Isabella gets more mercenary soldiers to join her cause for her invasion of England. And around late 1326 is when the invasion happens. Isabella, Mortimer, Edward III, who's still Prince Edward at this point. He's about 13, or I'd say maybe 13 or 14 years old at this point. So he's still quite young, but he's about beginning to be a teenager at this point, I think. I don't know if Philippa goes with them, or if it's just Prince Edward who goes with his mother in the invasion. I'm not exactly sure. But yeah, the invasion force lands, and not surprisingly, there's hardly any resistance to meet them when Isabella arrives. They arrive, they march inland, and town after town, city after city, person after person, from the lowest peasant to the remaining highest noblemen, join Isabella over Edward and Despenser. So poor King Edward is forced to flee. He flees with Despenser, Despenser's father, I think, who's known as Despenser Sr., and they take with them maybe just a few bags of wealth that they have with them. They flee, and I think they manage to get to either Wales or Scotland before they're finally captured by Isabella and Mortimer's forces. The Despensers are brought before Isabella, and she kind of goes easy on Despenser Sr. because maybe he wasn't as bad as his son is. So she kind of goes easy on him. There's even a story that she didn't intend to actually execute Despenser Sr. Maybe she just wanted to sentence him to just life in prison, but not actually put him to death. But before that could happen, sadly, Despenser Sr. is taken out, executed, and as the story goes, his remains are just thrown to the dogs, basically. Now, Dispenser Jr., Edward's favorite, knows that he's going to have a much more gruesome execution. So while he's imprisoned, he tries everything to commit suicide so he doesn't have to go through the horrible execution that he's destined for. I think he tries to starve himself while he's sitting in jail. But of course that doesn't work, so he's taken out and he's sentenced to the same execution that William Wallace, Braveheart, was sentenced to. And of course that's the horrible medieval execution of hanging, drawing, and quartering. The story goes that while she watches, Isabella is just standing there eating a pear because she's enjoying every minute of this horrible execution that her enemy is going through. She's really getting her revenge. So yeah, Dispenser is hung almost to the point of death. Then he's cut down, tied to something, and that's when his stomach is cut open, his insides are all poured out, spilled out, due to the rumor that he might have been one of the king's lovers. His genitals are cut off and then burned in front of him. And finally, he's beheaded. So, that's basically what the drawing and quartering execution was like. It was definitely not an easy going and quick execution. So pretty bad ending for someone. Meanwhile, Edward is held for a time as prisoner under house arrest. First he's forced to abdicate. Edward II is, of course, finally forced to abdicate and to give power to his young son, Edward III. Then he's held for a time under house arrest. I think the first castle he's held prisoner in is called Kenilworth Castle. And then he's eventually moved. The former king is eventually moved to Berkeley Castle, which is one of the castles that I'd like to visit if I ever return on another trip to England. I'd like to visit Berkeley Castle if I ever get back to England someday. And what's neat about Berkeley Castle is today it's still in pretty good condition. It's not lying in ruins like a lot of medieval castles are. Berkeley Castle is pretty well preserved up to today. And the cell that Edward was held in is pretty well preserved today. So Edward is held in Berkeley Castle under house arrest. And of course more rumors come out that there are plots to rescue him by people who are still loyal to him. So finally, Isabella and Mortimer know what they have to do, so Edward would not be rescued. But before that happens, they get, or as the story goes, they get word, and Prince Edward gets word around September 21st, 1327. Edward and his mother get word that the former king has suddenly died, has suddenly passed away in his imprisonment at Berkeley. Now, today, historians don't think the former king, Edward II, just died peacefully of natural causes. We believe he was murdered. Either murdered or he got away somehow. But personally, I believe the murder theory. I believe the murder theory. I don't believe the theory that he got away. I'm not saying that theory is wrong. I just personally believe the theory that the former king, was murdered. That's what I believe. And of course, the way he was murdered, there's the famous story that he died when the guards, or the assassins, whatever you want to call them, shoved a red-hot poker up his bowels, or his anus, through using a cow horn, basically burning him from the inside out. That's how he supposedly was murdered. Now, that's the story that stuck around for hundreds of years. Of course, we can't prove that that's really the way this guy was murdered, but it's the one that's survived for hundreds of years. Although today, what I've heard on documentaries is tour guides at Berkeley Castle like to say that Edward was probably murdered not by the red-hot poker, but simply by suffocating him with a pillow or a mattress. Even though a lot of people like to believe the red-hot poker story, but it's more likely that he was murdered by suffocation with a pillow or mattress. And the reason they came up with the red-hot poker story is because Edward II might have been homosexual. So that's one of the reasons why historians at the time, or storytellers at the time, thought of the red-hot poker story, simply because it was punishing Edward for being gay. But today, historians think that it's more likely that Edward II was murdered by being suffocated rather than being murdered with the red-hot poker. So anyway, King Edward is dead, even though most people believe it probably was murder over dying of natural causes or illness. It was most likely murder. So Isabella and Mortimer most likely had the former king murdered. Of course, they won't admit to any of that. So Edward is buried. I think Berkeley Castle is in the region of Gloucestershire. So instead of Westminster Abbey, King Edward II is now buried. His tomb is in Gloucester Cathedral. Even though some people like myself think, wait a minute, he was a king, so why couldn't he be buried at Westminster Abbey? Why does he have to be buried at Gloucester Cathedral? So there is a question as to that, of course, especially with me. I wonder that sometimes. But anyway, he's buried, his tomb is at Gloucester Cathedral, not Westminster Abbey. And of course, Isabella and Mortimer have Isabella's son, crowned the new King Edward III, but since he's still young, he's basically run by his mother and her lover, Mortimer. And unfortunately, Isabella and Mortimer start acting very similar to the way Edward and Despenser acted in the past. So they become the new unpopular rulers of the kingdom. Eventually, around 1330, I think it is, Edward III is now old enough to rule the kingdom himself. So he finally rises up against his mother and Mortimer. He surprises them during a raid one night over at Nottingham Castle, I think. He arrests both of them. Isabella is reported to have shouted, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer." But of course, young Edward does not have pity on him. He orders Mortimer, he accuses him of treason and orders him executed by hanging. Isabella, on the other hand, since she's still the new king's mother, since she's still the queen mother, she is not executed, thankfully. She is just forced to give up all her reigns of power and retire to one of the noble castles. She's still allowed to visit her children and grandchildren at the royal court. She's just not allowed to hold any type of power anymore. So she ends her days, despite the rumor that she is sentenced to live alone at Castle Rising, which is another historic medieval castle in England. Not exactly sure where in England it's located, but it's another historic castle in England. Despite the rumors that Isabella spends the rest of her years locked up at Castle Rising, and eventually over time going insane and going mad, most historians think that she lived the rest of her days in pretty decent comfort, pretty good conditions, not any conditions that would cause her to go insane, nothing like that. So she is allowed to visit her son, her children, her daughter-in-law, Queen Philippa, and her grandchildren at the royal court. She's just not allowed to hold any type of power anymore like she used to. So Isabella spends the rest of her life in pretty decent comfort, and she passes away in around 1358, I think. So she's still alive during the Black Death episode. She's still alive during the beginning of what we now call the 100 Years' War, when Edward III invades France and tries to take over France for the first time. in what would eventually become known to history as the 100 Years' War. Isabella is still alive up to those events before passing away. I'm guessing she's in her 60s or 70s when she finally passes in 1358, around that time. So yeah, that's the story of Queen Isabella, the she-wolf of France. I'm sorry, but I don't remember what cathedral she was buried at when she died. There's a story that she is buried in her wedding dress and still holding her husband's heart, but I don't know how accurate that story is, especially the way she, supposedly the way she did away with her gay husband in the end. I don't know if that really connects to wanting to be buried still wearing her wedding dress and holding her murdered husband's heart. But that's the story. Unfortunately, the cathedral she was buried in was, I think, demolished during Henry VIII's time, when he started becoming a Protestant and getting rid of all the Catholic churches and abbeys that were spread all over the country. And then I think the rest of the remains of that cathedral were destroyed during the Blitz in World War II by the German Luftwaffe. Sorry. So, unfortunately, Isabella's tomb no longer exists. It's gone. The whole church is basically in ruins now because of what King Henry VIII did to it and what the German Air Force did to it during the Blitz. At least that's the story I know. But yeah, that's all in all the notorious things Queen Isabella was known to have done during her life, whether they be true or whether they be just stories to villainize her. All in all, she pretty much got away with what she did. So she got away with it, which is what a lot of historical figures did. They got away with what they did due to the time frame they were living in and the society they came from. But yeah, that's her story, so at least as far as I know it, or heard about it, or learned about it. So now you know the true story of the French chick that Mel Gibson fell in love with in the film Braveheart. Who I have to admit is pretty attractive in that movie, even though the real Isabella was too young at the time to play a role in that movie. But she is pretty attractive. For Hollywood's sake, they had to make her that attractive. But yeah, that's the true story of that character, and I hope you enjoyed it. So, thanks guys. Talk to you soon. Bye.